This is The Science of Kabbalah with Rav Yitzhak Michelson.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know who's staying, who's going, but Boker Tov. So I understand that you guys have been learning with Rabbi Mervis and learning Halakha. I'm going to go a little bit different route, but we're going to focus on the idea of Halakha. But what I themed the lesson today was the idea of continuing the illumination of Chanukah and how there's a connection between Chanukah, Shabbat, and Halakha. And this is a message that was given by Rebbe Nachman of Breslov in Likutei Maharan, and Likutei Maharan Tanina, in the second volume of Likutei Maharan, where he gave this incredible message on Chanukah, Yemei Chanukah, the days of Chanukah, that he gave on Shabbat Chanukah. You might say to yourself, what does that have to do with anything? I mean, Chanukah is over, but he goes into an incredible Torah that's actually a very long Torah, where he connects Shabbat and he connects Halakha, and I think it's very important. Why is that? Well, we live in a day today where, if you're connected to social media, if you're connected to the world at all, you get on social media, you get on Facebook and you see, these arguments going on. You see even frum Jews going at each other with what's going on in the world, whether it's here in Eretz Yisrael with the third elections that we're going to shortly, or you're seeing what's going on in America. For those of us that are originally from Artzot HaBrit, we see what's going on there, and there's all kinds of craziness. This is something that has bothered me for a few years, especially when we're talking about those of us who identify, you want to call it normative Judaism or observant Judaism, Torah observant Judaism, that I even see people within our own community that rail against halakha, that somehow they think that because we have come into modern times, that somehow, because we come into modern times, that somehow halakha needs to change with the times. And nothing could be further from the truth. I think part of the problem is that we grew up, many of us, in Chutz La'aretz, in America or in other places, even if you grew up in, let's say, Great Britain. So there's a tradition that you grow up with related to rights. In the U.S., you have the Constitution, and everybody learns when they go to a secular school that the Constitution gives people some inalienable rights. And you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's great. It's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying the Constitution is not an amazing document. It is an amazing document, the Constitution. The difference is that you cannot look at Judaism as a rights-based religion, as a rights-based covenant. It's not a rights-based covenant. It's a covenant of responsibility and obligation. And so that when you're talking about halakha, which comes from the Hebrew holech or halach, the idea of to walk, which we know is the verb in modern Hebrew, it becomes a situation of learning how we walk, right? This is how we walk with Hashem. We have such an amazing zchut to live in this amazing city, in Ir HaRuach, in the city of Ruach, in the city of Spirit, in the city of wind. And sometimes I think we take it for granted the heritage that we have here when we walk down the streets of Tzfat. I mean, I live right down the street. I come down, I have the Ari HaKadosh in the cemetery below me, and I look across from my merpeset, and there's Rabbi Shimon. And we have Rabbi Yosef Karo, who gave us the Shulchan Aruch, which is one of the main compendium of Jewish law that we follow. How many people know that if you walk out here and you turn to your left and you walk down one street, that there's the kever of Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yafet? Okay, and I walk by there every day. One of the he was an Amorah. And you're going to be amazed to find out, as I was when I learned Gemara, when I learned the Talmud, that the opinions that he brings, and not only the opinions that he brings, but the opinions that he brings related to what we're talking about. what we're talking about today. What am I talking about? In the Talmud, in the Masechet Yomah, in Yomah, where we learn about the Moedim, and specifically talking about Yom Kippur, the Halakha and the laws of Yom Kippur. But in Yomah, in 29a of Yomah, there's a discussion that goes on the validity of the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, and whether or not Megillat Esther was a book that was divinely inspired and how it showed up in our Tanakh. And there's a discussion that goes back and forth. And one of the things that they discuss in Yoma 29 is this idea of that with the advent of Esther and with the advent of Purim, that somehow miracles ended. And then one of the Amoraim says, well, what about Chanukah? If miracles ended, what about Chanukah? So they say, well, then they go into discussion of, well, the miracles ended as related to those things that were written down. But why is this interesting, and what is the connection that's brought with our Amorah that's right here, Rabbi Benjamin Bar Yafet? He makes a connection with a verse in Tehillim, in Tehillim 22, that starts off, Lam Natzech al Ayelet HaShachar Mizmor LeDavid. That to the musical director related to Ayelet Shachar, the doe of dawn, right? And so there's a connection to this idea of doe and dawn. And if you look at Yomah, it talks about this idea that the male doe, is in love with the female doe, so to speak, in the same way that Achashverosh was in love with Esther. Okay, that there was this kind of love between them, and it's connected to dawn. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, we just started the new cycle of Daf Yomi yesterday, and we started Masechet Brachot. And what do we learn in Masechet Brachot? And we see a lot of people when I'm talking about these people having arguments about the arguments about Halakha in modern times and how we keep Halakha. So one of the things that you have, we joke as Jews, we say 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? And there are some people that just don't understand the style of argumentation that goes on with the rabbis in the Talmud. And I often use Masechet Brachot, which we just started yesterday in Daf Yomi, as a perfect example of how the style of argumentation goes. And what is the connection to Ayelet Shachar? Well, what happens is at the beginning of the Masechet in Brachot, it starts off with Be'ematai Korin et Shema Be'eruvim. The idea of from when do we know to say the Shema in the evening? And then it goes into the concept of when the Kohanim come in to eat, when the Kohanim are able to come in and eat the Truma. And then it goes into a whole argumentation that goes on with Rabbi Eliezer coming with one opinion. He says to the first watch, which we believe is up until 10 o'clock. And then it says, the Chachamim say ad chatzot, until midnight. And then it says that Rav Gamliel, now, his sons come to him because his sons went to a mishteh, which we believe was a wedding party. And as a result of going to this mishteh, they said, we haven't yet said the Kriyat Shema, the nighttime Kriyat Shema. What do we do? And he says, She'ya'aleh Amud HaShachar. So the same concept of Ayelet HaShachar that we see in Psalm 22 that's brought by our Amorah, right down the street, Rabbi Benjamin Bar Yafet, is also brought in the beginning of Masechet Brachot, in this idea that Rav Gamliel says Ad HaShachar, that you can say it until Ad HaShachar. But then we go into more, and there's a discussion as to when is Amsei Tachochavim, when do we have 3 stars come out, and when is actual nighttime for when we can say it. And they kind of go back and forth. And what's the opinion? What's the rove, what we call the rove or the majority opinion, which is so important and what we follow in Halakha, is it says that we follow the Chachamim. We follow Chachamim, we follow Chazal, we follow the majority of sages that said Ad HaChatzot. Why? It says so that we don't sin. What does that mean, so that we don't sin? Well, the issue is that if you say to yourself, here it comes upon midnight, and you're at a party, like the sons of Rav Gamliel, and you say to yourself, wow, I got time. I can wait until daylight. I can wait until sunlight. And then what happens is you had a glass of wine, and you're driving home, and you get home, and it's late, and the next thing you know, you find yourself plopped down in a chair, and the next thing you wake up, and the sun's already up, and you didn't say Kriyat Shema. So this is a perfect example of. So I started talking about the idea that things are very bad in the world, and this idea of the difference between rights and obligations and so forth, and that the idea that we have really an obligation-based situation for us today. It's not based on the U.S. Constitution. It's not based on even the laws of Medinat Yisrael. If we consider ourselves Jews that follow a covenant with Hashem, then it's about that covenant. And so we read a very interesting verse, and there's a very interesting word. I love Hebrew. I love Hebrew words, and I love seeing what Hebrew words actually mean. And I'm one of those people that sometimes get annoyed when I look at English translations, and I use them. I use the Hebrew and the English translations of different books. But I often get annoyed by it because I see that sometimes what happens is the translations are given to us to make it easier for us to understand. And I think that that's great. It's good for us to be able to more easily understand what Hashem wants from us, what he desires for us, and what our obligations are. But at the same time, there are sometimes words that are translated too easily from the Hebrew into English, and they don't really give you the impact of what the Torah is actually teaching us and what the relationship with Hashem is really about. And one of those is found in Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 9, where it says, Vayadata ki Hashem Elokecha, hu ha'elokim ha'el ha'ne'eman, shomer ha'brit v'ha'chesed. That's the beginning of that verse, which says, know that Hashem, your God, is God, that he is the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love. And it goes on to say, Li'ohavav u'l'shomrei mitzvotav le'elef dor, that it to those who love him and keep his mitzvot and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, right? But when we read that idea of v'hachesed, or habrit v'hachesed, this covenant of which with chesed, it's usually translated loving kindness. The issue that I have with that is that chesed being translated as loving kindness doesn't really give you the full impact of what chesed really means. Okay? Because at its root, chesed can be translated as a joint obligation. A joint obligation. So that when you're looking at the terminology in the Torah, whether it's in the written, whether it's Torah shebechtav or Torah shebal peh, whether you're looking at the oral Torah or you're looking at the written Torah, when you're looking at this idea of chesed, when you see chesed, when you see that idea of loving kindness, whether it's chesed, whether it's chasteh, at its root is talking about a joint obligation. So that when you then look at something where it says la'asod chesed, that you should do chesed, that you should do loving kindness, whether it's on our side or whether it's on the side of Hashem, it's talking about doing or making a joint obligation, which goes back to this concept of the importance and the significance of halakha that we're talking about. And really, there's no other word in the Torah that relates to this concept of obligation. I mean, there are modern words that we see today, like chovah. Chovah is the modern word for obligation in Hebrew. But it does not have the impact of that idea of the obligation, that joint obligation in a covenant relationship with Hashem, that chesed does. It just doesn't. You have a couple of other words that would also connect. Yosher, where we get the word yashal, this idea of being straight or being right. Tzedek, which we usually translate as righteousness, and mishpat or mishpatim, which also has to do with halakha, the idea of judgments, the judgment of Hashem. So it really comes down to the idea of the type of behavior that we display, and the type of behavior that we're obligated to have before Hashem. So that when we see these three, they're very significant. Yosher, this idea actually can have some kind of connection to what we're talking about, and have a relationship to this, because we see in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges, it says, Kol ish asa et hayashar be'enav, that everyone did right what was right in his own eyes. We read in Judges, right? Very famous verse, everybody knows it. So this goes back to that idea of rights. What rights do we have? We don't have any rights. If you have a relationship with Hashem, you have no rights. You have responsibilities and obligations. And this is why it becomes an issue. This is the trap that I think we need to avoid when we see this kind of thing come up. When we come up with this idea that we live in modern times, and therefore halakha has to change in order to fit our modern times, we fall into a trap. And what I would say is that rather than looking at the idea that we have come into modern times, and there's no question, obviously, we in a secular calendar, we're now in the year 2020. So we're living in a modern day, there's no question. But Judaism does not follow modern times. What Judaism follows, and what halakha follows, is what I would call modern concession. What do I mean by modern concession? I'll give you a practical example of this, okay? A practical example would be the difference between what we call chalav stam and chalav Yisrael, okay? Chalav stam, the idea of milk, and chalav Yisrael, the idea of milk that's been guarded over, that's been watched, made sure that the cow was milked by a Jew and it was overseen by a Jew. And so there are a lot of people that only eat chalav Yisrael. They only have milk that is chalav Yisrael, only take cheese that is chalav Yisrael, and etc. What do I mean about this modern concession? So if you look at the halakha, what does our halakha tell us about chalav, about milk? It tells us that milk has to come from a kosher source. Zeu, that's the halakha. Milk has to come from a kosher source. If you look at the U.S. today, we're talking about modern times, in order for milk to be certified USDA grade A milk, it has to come from a cow. Okay? What does that have to do with halakha? Well, when you read about chalav stam, for instance, in the Gemarot, in the Talmud, what we learn is that in the times of Europe, and there's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov, who had a disciple whose last name they called Shulchan Aruch, because every time they asked him a question, he would say, I'll have to check the Shulchan Aruch. And they sent him to a king. They went with the king that hated the Jews, and they went to this king, and the king served coffee, and Shulchan Aruch said, we can't drink the coffee. Why can't you drink my coffee? Now the king is getting even crazier. They wouldn't drink his coffee. So they wouldn't drink his coffee, and he got really upset. The king drank the coffee and the king got sick. What happens? He calls the chef in, and the chef comes in and he says, Chef, what happened? He says, well, we ran out of milk, and the only milk we had was pig's milk. So I served pig's milk. And the king says to himself, how does this guy have a God that even knows what kind of milk is being served? So as a result, this king that hated, so they went to the Baal Shem Tov, and everybody wanted the Baal Shem Tov to go. They didn't want Shulchan Aruch to go, because they knew he was going to be Yashar with the halakha, with the Shulchan Aruch. And the Baal Shem Tov, they said to him, Rebbe, you're really the one that should have gone. And he said, you know what? If I would have gone, I would have figured out a way to drink the milk, the pig's milk. Okay? So what I'm saying is that we have a situation where we have a modern concession, right? The modern concession is not that halakha changed, because the halakha is that milk has to come from a kosher source. And since milk in America can only come from cow's milk, then the only responsibility you have in the halakha is to make sure that that milk came from a kosher source. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with chumrot. if you want to keep a stringency, if you want to keep a chumrah, that for you, Chalav Yisrael is the only thing, Baruch Hashem, b'vakasha. In many cases, I follow that. Okay, but I'm just saying, if I'm traveling and there's an issue and I get stuck and I'm late and I go into a store and the only thing that's available for me is milk from a kosher source and it's not Chalav Yisrael, am I going to deny myself and go crazy with a chumrah that is really not according to halakha? No. We have situation in halakha that teaches us in the Shulchan Aruch, whether you're following Rav Yosef Karo, the Machaber, who gives the Sephardic opinion, or whether you're keeping Rav Moshe Isserles, who's the Ramah. We have Lachat Chila B'diavad, or B'di'evet. Okay, we have the way in which it's the perfect way to keep the mitzvah, or to keep the halakha, and we have a way that we can keep it where we're not being as stringent, but we still fulfill the mitzvot. That's the important thing to keep in mind. The important thing to keep in mind in this whole thing is not to kill yourself. There are people that try to kill themselves. Now I'm talking about the importance of halakha. I'm stressing the importance of halakha. But I'm saying at the same time, we have to realize that the need for us to practice halakha, the need for us to be in this joint relationship and obligation with Hashem, but at the same time to do it in a way that we're not overloading ourselves to the point that we then fall into that trap and we think, this is just too much. Yeah.
I want to make a point about Halakha. In America, it's one situation, but in many places, if you end up taking a stopover in an airplane and you're ending up in Finland, you can't drink the milk.
No, absolutely.
Right? And that's true all over the world.
Absolutely.
You don't, we can rely, many people rely on the USDA, but, people who don't.
Right.
That's a position, a very legitimate position, but certainly the rest of the world, we have to be aware that.
No, there's no question. And I should have been more clear in what I was trying to say was that obviously when I'm in that situation, I obviously look for a heksher. Okay, but what I'm saying is if I can find a kosher heksher, and it's not necessarily Chalav Yisrael, I will have that. As long as I know it's got a legitimate heksher that I recognize as being a good heksher, I don't have a problem with it. But yeah, 100%. I'm just trying to give an example geographically of how the modern concession came in and just giving you an example. 100% that other places in the world you're going, you have a big issue with having, milk or dairy or a cup of coffee somewhere where you don't know. I mean, I'm getting ready to travel later in the year, and we're stopping in Lisbon, in Portugal, is our layover. And we have a long layover overnight, and yeah, they have a great Jewish tradition there, a great Jewish heritage, and we're looking forward. We always, if we have long stopovers, we try to do like a Jewish heritage walking tour and see what's related. But there's probably nothing we're going to be able to eat anywhere in Lisbon. So what does all this have to do with the idea of bringing the illumination of Chanukah into the rest of the year and this connection to Shabbat and Halakha? So just before the end of Chanukah, I was learning this Torah with my wife and Likutei Moharan Tanina from Rebbe Nachman. And we know that Chanukah has many themes. It has the theme, obviously, it's talking about, this great battle that was won and coming against the assimilation of the Greek culture that was taking over the world at the time. And of course, it's the idea also of the miracle that happened with the oil, the continued illumination of the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Nachman starts off in that Torah where he says, Yemei Chanukah hem Yemei Hoda'ah, k'mo shekatuv, v'kavu'u shimonat Yemei Chanukah elo leodot ulahalel. And he's talking about the Al HaNisim, the additional Al HaNisim prayer that we add in the Shemona Esrei during Chanukah and in the Hallel that we say the Hallel every day. It's this idea that the days of Chanukah are days of what he says? Hoda'ah. That they're days of thanksgiving. and that these 8 days, according to the end of the Al Hanisim prayer, it says, "V'kavou shemanat yemei Chanukah elo lehodot ol Hallel," that they were established these 8 days of Chanukah for thanksgiving and praise. He says. And what does he do? He goes on to say, "V'imei hoda'ah zeh bichinat sha'asu'a olam haba," that this idea of thanksgiving is the delight of the world to come. He says, because the essence of the delight of the world to come is thanking and praising Hashem. That's what he says at the beginning of this. And he talks about it, the idea of acknowledging Hashem and knowing Hashem, that all of this thanksgiving and praising of Hashem, what it does is, it is the essence. He says, the bichinat, it's the aspect of the world to come, the olam haba, or the delight of the world to come, of the olam haba. And, oftentimes I think people miss the idea that when you're talking about Likutei Maharan, when you're talking about Rebbe Nachman, they look at the Breslov community, they think, oh, Breslov, it's all just a bunch of guys that are singing and dancing and having fun, and, it's all about the simcha, because Rebbe Nachman talks about joy. But one of the strongest things that Rebbe Nachman repeats over and over and over again is the need to study halakha on a daily basis. I mean, he made this a theme of so much of his Torot, was about this idea. We even see in the first Masechet, in the first Mishnah of Masechet Sanhedrin, in the Talmud, it says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek le'olam haba, that all of Israel has what? A portion in the world to come. So he's connecting this idea of the world to come. However, there's a case that's made that this portion in the world to come relates only to people, and there's a machloket, there's an argument about this, that it's really related to only those who fall within that framework of what we talked about, related to chesed, related to the joint obligation of those who fall within that framework of the joint obligation of being connected to Hashem and keeping His Torah. Now, from a Kabbalistic perspective, when you're talking about Chanukah, okay, we know that there are 8 days of Chanukah. That's what he says. Yemei Chanukah, the days of Chanukah, and he talks about these 8 days. We know on the Tree of Life, on the Eitz Chaim, that there are 10 sferot, that there are these 10 attributes or emanations, or the way in which Hashem shows His ratzon. He shows us His will, right? And the 8th one is what? The Sfera of Hod. And Hod is considered glory or splendor. So he talked about Hoda'ah, thanksgiving, and now he says Hod, that the 8 days is connected to that 8th Sfera, which is connected to the concept of Hoda'ah, which is connected to the concept of this idea of thanksgiving. Now the Ari HaKadosh brings a teaching that the kavanot, that the intention that we have on Chanukah is that one should bring down light from the level of Binah. Binah is below, we have Keter, Chokhmah, and Binah. We have Keter, which is the crown. We have Chokhmah, which is wisdom. We have Binah, which is understanding, right? So he says that light has to be brought down from Binah. Binah is Ima. It's feminine. Chokhmah is Abba, masculine. So we have Abba and Ima. Chachma and Binah. That light is then drawn down from Binah through the 6 sfirot that are called Zeir Anpin, right? We have Chesed, Guvra, Teferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and then we have Malchut below. So we have those 6 that are called Zeir Anpin, and they're brought down to this level of Hod, right? But one of the things that we learn in Kabbalah is that light that is brought down then returns back up to its source, right? So you have light that's being drawn down from Binah to Hod, to that 8th, and then drawn back up. But what does it do? As it's being drawn down through Zeir Anpin, what it does is it builds up, the Ari Kadosh teaches that it builds up what? Malchut Nukva, the feminine aspect of Malchut. Malchut, sovereignty, kingship, or the world that we live in. We live in at the level of Malchut. So it builds up that feminine aspect. So in Kabbalah, this concept of ascending and descending light or illumination that we're talking about connects back to the source. So thus we have Binah connected to Hod, to these 8 days of Chanukah. And even the Sefer Bahir, one of the early Kabbalistic texts that we follow, says what about this? It says, for you shall call understanding, Binah, a mother, Ima, which we said, it's Ima, right? Then Chazal teach us that Binah, it says, Binah yetera nitna li isha, that women are given an extra measure of Binah. Women are given an extra measure of Binah. Why I say this is because this often becomes an issue with, and I hope I'm not saying anything too controversial here, but oftentimes this idea of rights comes up oftentimes with women. And there are many times where I'll sit at a Shabbat table and I'll talk about the idea of the level of elevation that women have in this idea of having that extra measure of Binah, being connected to Hashem in a way that you are part of the creative process in a way that men could never be. And sometimes people look at me, women look at me, and they're like, I don't see that. They don't see the elevated level that they're on, and the rights not the rights, but the obligations and responsibilities that they have, and how powerful that is, how powerful their halakha is, how powerful that is. And this idea of Bina, why? Because Chachma is just an idea. Chachma is when you have an idea. Bina is the conceptualization of that idea. So in truth is that women, in having that extra level of Bina, we talk about this like women's intuition. So you have more of a peripheral view than men do. We're very yashar, chokhmah. Yeah, I can learn, I can teach, I can study Torah, I can learn this and have it in my head. But in many ways, as men, we're like this. How many times you see? I used to tell this story when I would talk to men. About the idea of women speak like 25,000 words a day and men speak 15,000 words a day. I said, save 5,000 words when you get home. Because what ends up happening is oftentimes you see that a man comes home from work and a wife says, how was your day? Good. How was your meeting? Oh, it was nice. What'd your boss say? Oh, he said everything was good. How was your day? Well, I was on the phone rang, and then Bobby got up on the counter, and there was milk on the counter, and the milk spilled, and the glass broke, and then what she wants is not an answer. She doesn't want him to come up with a solution, which chokhmah-based, we're very good at. We can give you a solution, because the first thing we want to say is, well, how come the milk was too close to the counter, and why did Bobby get up on the thing? And then he doesn't understand why she storms out of the room and slams the door. When all she wanted him to say was, honey, let me go upstairs, let me change my clothes, let me come down, we'll have a glass of wine, and we'll talk about our days. She wants empathy. She doesn't want a solution. But that's the difference between us. You have Bina, we have Chokhmah. And what is Bina and Chachma? Bina and Chachma together is the unity of Hashem. Right? It's the unity of Hashem. The Zohar says that Bina and Chachma are two friends that are never separated. Abba and Ima. Father and mother. Never separated. When we get to the second part of Likutei Maharan that Rebbe Nachman brings, he says, Uvechinat todah shehu sha'asu ha'olam haba, ze bechinat halachot. So he says that giving thanks, this idea that Uvechinat todah, this essence or aspect of thanksgiving, shehu sha'asu ha'olam haba, this which is the delight of the world to come, which he said before, he says, bechinat halachot. This is the aspect of halachot, ki ha-halachot shezochin lilmod, בפרט מי שזוכה לחדש בהם, זה בחינת שעשו העולם הבא. And then he goes into this, he continues this concept of this idea of halakha. And he talks about this concept of halakha also being related to the delight of the world to come. So if he's saying that the idea that hoda'ah, that thanksgiving, is the delight of the world to come, has the essence of the delight of the world to come, and now he's saying halakha also is bichinat halakha, that it's the aspect of halakha, then he's connected thanksgiving with halakha. He's saying that basically they're the same thing, that conceptually when we're talking about conceptualizing from Chokhmah to Binah, that conceptually Hoda'ah, thanksgiving, and Halakha are the same thing. This is what Rebbe Nachman brings. And it's this idea of Chasdei Hashem, again, this idea of chesed, the idea of that joint obligation. It's the importance of connecting halakha to the olam haba, and that should not be lost on us by any way possible. I mean, yes, we live in the olam hazeh, we live in this world, but everything should be not that we do halakha in order to gain the olam haba, but we do the halakha to change what's going on in the world today in order to obtain the olam haba, to bring the olam haba, to bring Mashiach soon, speedily in our days. Amen. And this is why I stressed my dismay earlier in this idea of people thinking that somehow that halakha changes with the times. This idea of somehow having modern times and that halakha has to change in order to meet the modern times. And then he goes on in Torah, in the Pasuk Dalet, in the fourth verse of this Torah, and he connects thanksgiving, this idea of hoda'ah and halakha, and he says that it illuminates speech, that it brings illumination to speech. And then he goes into the names of Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Kel, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and Elokim. And he connects those three names of Hashem in the idea of helping us to perfect our speech. And Rebbe Nachman says that these three names, that Elokim corresponds to Torah. And you will be for him an Elokim. Basically, when Moshe Rabbeinu was sent to Paro, Hashem says you will be an Elokim to him. Right? This is the verse that he's quoting from Shemot, from Exodus chapter 4. And he says the meaning of he will serve as your mouth, talking about Moshe Rabbeinu again from that verse. He says Elokim, or Torah, illuminates the mouth, namely speech, because the rabbi teaches his student an unswerving path in his Torah.
Can I just add that I learned that this year, Pei, Ayin Pei. So Pei is all about the pet.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about the mouth. So
Right.
this year we have to learn how to be silent and when to speak and when not to speak.
Awesome. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, the connections, and beautiful how Hashem is revealing these things to people. He goes on and he talks about this perfected speech, that through those names of Hashem, that our speech is perfected. And what does he say that this does? He says this gives us Lashon Kodesh. It gives us the holy tongue, which is Ivrit. It gives us the ability to speak with a holy tongue. And then what does he do? He links this with Shabbat. He says that the holy tongue is linked to Shabbat. What does he say? Shlemut hadibor hu bechinat lashon hakodesh, ki chol lashonot hamim hem hasarim, ve'en lahem shlemut, ki nikra'in lashon ilgim, and then he quotes Yeshaya, Lamed Bet, ve'en shlemut rak lashon hakodesh. And then he says this, ulashon hakodesh hu mikushar l'shabbat. So he says this perfected speech that brings the holy tongue, which he says are lacking in the nations of the world, as opposed to us, as opposed to Bnei Israel. They are imperfect and are called the tongue of stammerers, he says, as opposed to Lashon Kodesh. And he says what? The holy tongue, the Lashon Kodesh, is linked to Shabbat, as in Yeshaya, that verse in Lamed Bet 58:13 that says, nor speak of matters, talking about weakness. And then he goes on, and he talks about what? He connects this holy tongue to Shabbat, the Lashon Kodesh. And then he talks about that through all of these things, that through that, we have the ability. Remember, we talked about Chanukah. We talked about the illumination of Chanukah, this idea of bringing illumination into the rest of the year through Chanukah. And he calls Hanukah Hoda'ah, thanksgiving. And he connects Hoda'ah, thanksgiving, to Halakha. And then he talks about the halakha, bringing perfected speech through the names of Hashem and connected in that joint obligation. And then he brings about the Lashon Kodesh, this idea of the holy tongue and the holy tongue connected to Shabbat. And then he brings Shabbat and says, what does Shabbat have the ability to do? But Shabbat has the ability to bring us the illumination into the 6 days of the week. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, Havdalah is one of the most joyous and one of the sad parts of my life. And what I did was, several years ago, I changed my thinking and I changed my perspective on it. And rather than getting sad, I should say it used to be like that. For me now, what I've done in the last couple of years is I changed my thinking and I thought to myself, rather than thinking about this as a sad time of the day where I'm coming out of Shabbat, I'm thinking of the joy of the fact that I now have 6 days to prepare for Shabbat. So this is what Rebbe Nachman is really teaching us, that through this connection to Shabbat and Halakha, we have the ability to illuminate the rest of the weekdays. The very first chapter in the Shabbat section of the Shulchan Aruch is entitled "To be careful with the kavod of Shabbat," to be careful with the honor of Shabbat. And the chapter itself teaches us that we're supposed to honor Shabbat with sufficient food, even if it means skimping during the week, right? And then it goes on and talks about this idea of having a number of different dishes. This is from the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim 242. And then the Mishnah Brura elaborates on this, related to the idea that you should have at least 2 different dishes. And then it goes in and talks about how maybe you should eat a little bit from that, along with the Friday night meal, you should eat a little bit of what you're going to have on Shabbat lunch, that you should also eat on Friday night, to try to connect it to. And really, this idea we even have in the Ma'yididut, in the song, in one of the Zmeirot that we do, Ma'yididut, it talks about this idea of having different types of delicacies and having these different dishes. The source for the Mishnah Brura here is actually from the Zohar, where it says, and on Shabbat night, a person should eat from all he has prepared, to show that this canopy of peace, this Shabbat, comprises all, as long as it does not detract from any dish of the day, that he has enough, those 2 dishes that we're talking about. And the way the Zohar envisions tasting a number of dishes is to taste, as I said, a bit of the day meal with the night meal, basically teaching us that all worldly delights, everything related to Gashmiut, to the physical world, can be elevated to holiness. And this is the thing about Halakha. This is the beauty of Halakha. Oftentimes people come to me like, oh, you crazy, even like Jews that are not observant. Oh, you crazy Jews, you have all this crazy laws, and you have all these crazy, you got to say this blessing and that blessing. And when you say to somebody very simply, rather than saying, oh, I have an obligation to do this, if you say to them, you know why I take that apple and I say, Borei Pri Ha'etz, before I eat that apple? Because I'm taking something that's mundane. And by saying a bracha, I'm taking it from the mundane and I'm raising it to the holiness. I'm raising it to the level of holiness. One more thing. How do we bring this all around? Okay? So there's another really interesting thing. What do we know that we follow in Halakha? We know that we have the Talmud. We know that we have the Shulchan Aruch. I said to you, we started Daf Yomi yesterday, so there's amazing connection in the Daf Yomi. Okay? Many people say to us, oh, you crazy people, you have this written Torah, and then you have all these rabbis arguing back and forth, and how do you know which rabbi, whatever? Here's an interesting connection for you. When I looked at this yesterday, I realized that if you look at Torah Shebechtav, Torah Shebechtav starts at what? Breshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So it starts with the letter Bet, right? When I read to you from the Talmud, from Masechet Brachot, it started Me'ematai, not Ematai, Me'ematai. It starts with a Mem. The Rashi Tevot of the letters, Bet and Mem, is Bam. Where do we see Bam? We see in the unity and talking about Chochman, Binah, the unity of Hashem and the joint obligation, is in the Shema. After we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and then we read the rest of the Shema, it says, Vidibarta Ba. You shall speak in them, both the written Torah, Torah shebichtav, and Torah shebal peh. Where do we else see this idea of Bam and this unity of Hashem? On Shabbat. This connection again to Shabbat and Halakha. Why? Because when you look at the Shmona Esrei of Arevit, of the Mariv Shabbat Shmona Esrei, what do we say? Ve'yanuchu ba. In Arevit, in Mariv of the Shmona Esrei on Shabbat. They shall rest in it, feminine. Shacharit in Musaf Shmona Esrei, we say Ve'yanuchu bo. We say rest in it, masculine. And then in Mincha and Shabbat Shmona Esrei, we say Ve'yanuchu bam. Ba bo ba. Feminine, masculine, them. Rest on them. So we have the unity of Hashem again in the Shmona Esrei of Shabbat, connecting all of this together. The passages from the Zohar, printed in many of the Sidurim, following the Shabbat prayers, bring all of this. Bring all of this. And go and look, you can see this. This night is the feminine aspect. Morning is the masculine aspect, and afternoon is the unification that we see. That is what we talked about, this idea of, I spoke about Chokhmah and Binah being this two friends that can never be separated, that brings about the unification through our observance of Halakha. And the Tur, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, who is part of the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, explaining why each Shabbat Amidah prayer has completely different opening. He gives this. He says that the evening refers to the Shabbat of the creation. But when we say the Shmona Esrei on the Shabbat, that it's talking about the Shabbat of creation, that the morning, the Shacharit, the Shabbat is the Shabbat of the giving of the Torah, and then the afternoon is the future Shabbat, the Shabbat of the Olam Haba, of the world to come, and he brings that on Orach Chaim 292. So if we follow that understanding, and then if we look back at what the Zohar tells us, to eat a little from each meal on Shabbat evening, or having these multiple dishes, it alludes to the Shabbat of creation, including an aspect of the giving of the Torah in the morning, and connecting both of them on the next day at Mincha to the Olam Haba. So we know that the Shabbat of creation occurred because Hashem rested. He stopped his creative work, even though the world was still not complete, because the Torah states, Vayivarech Elokim et Yom HaShvi, Vayikadesh Oto, Kivo Shabbat Mikol Melachto, Asher Bara Elohim Lasot. That we say in the Kiddush, right? That Hashem blessed and sanctified the seventh day, because on it he rested from all the work which Elohim created to make. And the Midrash states that when we say created to make, it means that that Hashem created the world incomplete. That the only way to make it to complete was to include human endeavor in it. What does it mean? The future giving of the Torah was already built into creation. The future giving of the Halakha was built into creation, as Rashi explains on the verse in Breshit, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, when it says, Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od, v'hi erev v'hi voker yom hashishi. That when Hashem finished creating, and he said everything was very good, there was evening and there was morning, yom hashishi, on that sixth day. The Torah added a hey. Rashi says the Torah added a hey there. Why? Because at the completion of creation, it was to tell us that he stipulated with them, this is what Rashi says, that he stipulated that this was on the condition that we, Yisrael, accept the 5 books of Torah. And Hey is the number 5. This is what Rashi brings. And then the Tanchuma on Breshit gives another explanation. It says the 6th day, they were all suspended until the 6th day, referring to the 6th day of Sivan. What's the 6th day of Sivan? The 6th day of Sivan is the day of the giving of the Torah. So the incompleteness of the creation of Hashem left room for the giving of the Torah, for the giving of the Halakha, which would enable mankind to perfect the world through human endeavor, through our own efforts. Ultimate leading to what? To Olam Haba. So really, at the end of the day, I could go on and on with this, on the idea of Chanukah, Chanu, they rested. You can make the connection with Chanu, meaning they rested, and Ka, being Ko. The idea Rebbe Nachman brings that Ka being related to Ko. Ko what? Ko Amar, thus you shall say, this is how you shall bless Bnei Yisrael. In the Berkat HaKohanim, he brings that, this idea of rest. So he connects all of these themes, all of this hoda'ah, this thanksgiving, to halakha, to perfected speech, to the Lashon Kodesh, to the idea of Shabbat, to the idea of Chanu and rest and Bam and the unity of Hashem, all meant to do one thing, to bring about the delight of the world to come. And not only is it the essence of the delight of the world to come, but he says that we have the ability to bring this illumination from Chanukah into the rest of the year, and not only into the rest of the year, but connecting it to Shabbat, to be able to illuminate from Shabbat into the rest of the week. And how do we do this? Through the keeping of Halakha. And what does it do? It not only gives us the essence of the Olam Haba, but he says it gives us the ability to experience some of the delight of the Olam Haba now, in this world. May we only merit to receive this and accept this, and I talk to myself first about this, and through that, and through the keeping of Halakha, and recognizing our joint obligation and our responsibilities to be connected to Hashem and keep His Halakha, that we should only be able to bring in the essence of the light of Shabbat into the 6 working days and experience the delight of the world to come now, and B'ezrat Hashem bring Mashiach ben Hirav Yameinu soon, speedily.